And I would just add to that, that was very similar to what I was going to say, May, which is that this notion that the fossil fuel companies should pay is not something that is part of our social dialogue right now. And so simply talking about this with your neighbors and community members and getting people to start thinking about it, because I don't honestly know that it's something that occurs to everyone. And yet, when we look at where we are with the tobacco industry, for example, I think most people, with the decades that are behind us now, since the big tobacco suits were at play, could see those similarities, right? And we can see the tobacco industry as the villain and recognize the benefit of calling them out and the regulations that have since followed. So socializing this notion, I think, is a really important part of the activism that we all can do.
Well, thank you all for sharing all these great thoughts and insights and experiences. And we're going to open it up for questions from all of you so we can have a conversation. But before we do, knowing that movement building is about making connections, we'd love for you to turn to your neighbor. Hopefully it's someone you don't know, but if it is, you can skip the introduction. But turn to your neighbor, introduce yourself, and take just 2 or 3 minutes and talk about other ideas you might have, or if there's something you didn't hear from the panel, other ways that you can imagine just, again, sort of non-lawyer, but lay people, activists, citizens, engaged community members getting involved in this. And then we'll open up, and you can share if you have a really great one, come to the mic and share it, or just, again, questions. So 2 to 3 minutes, get to know your neighbors. Well, clearly that was really invigorating, and people had a lot of ideas. Do you want to get up and share them? You're welcome to come up to the microphone here. Either I'd invite you to share what you and your neighbor talked about, and/or offer some questions. Let's try in our best form to keep it to a one-part question and a question. That'd be ideal. And please.
I have a simple question. As I read this graph, it looks like in the last 35 years, 62% of carbon has been emitted, right? And those were those 35 years in which the oil companies were obfuscating and lying and telling people that what they knew to be true was not true, correct? How much money did those oil companies make in those 35 years? That would be a powerful piece of information for our advocacy work.
Stephen, do you have that? Have you guys crunched those numbers?
A lot.
I know it's a lot, but if they made $5 trillion, let's argue that they should give $5 trillion to the city of San Francisco and everyone else to abate what's happening. I'd love to have that information.
That's a really good point, and I think it also brings up the urgency of this question of who's going to pay for climate change and why this kind of litigation is so important. Because if you look at what the oil companies are actually spending their money on, it's a lot of exploration and drilling for new oil and a lot of share buybacks, which means they are, they're not trying to advertise it, but they are giving their shareholders as much money as quickly as they can. And so because this industry is not an infinitely going concern, there is a limited window to get them to pay for the damage they've done before everyone just grabs the money and runs.
And dividends. I believe ExxonMobil is among the most consistent and generous, payers of dividends on their stocks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. He's a gentleman. So when I read Judge Allsup's opinion, it really seemed to me that he was pointing us in a direction for future cases. So I wanted to see if your analysis was similar. He focused a lot on the deception piece, and it seemed that he was suggesting that the argument didn't focus enough on that, or that was considered more like the cherry on top while we were focusing on the climate damages. And he didn't seem fully satisfied with our response to the answer, what could the fossil industry have done differently and still meet the US's energy security needs? Do you feel like in future cases there'll be more focus on the deception question?
I think the deception question is, or the deception facts are important for a variety of different reasons. They may not be the strongest argument, and I have to cabin my response because we are on appeal at the Ninth Circuit. So I think I agree with you that I think he focused on that. Now, what public nuisance says is you look at, again, a substantial interference, and so whether or not those statements would have come in under a public nuisance theory anyway. I think the hard thing about Judge Allsup in that decision is that he was, the motion was whether or not the case should go forward to an adjudication on its merits, and yet Judge Allsup didn't allow that. And so how much importance he would have put on that issue if the case was actually tried or actually litigated substantively, I think remains to be seen. We just didn't get that chance here. It'll be interesting to follow San Mateo and the other cases in California to see whether or not a state court analyzing state public nuisance focuses on that.
That's a great question.
Hi, my name's Alex. I'm from 350 Seattle, and my family's from the small island nation of Mauritius. It's a friendly criticism and a question that I have. So in the narrative around climate liability, in the panel a few times it was kind of said that the people that are really responsible for this are the fossil fuel industry. It's not the cities that are responsible for causing the harms, right? And I think that's true to a certain extent. The fossil fuel companies should be held accountable for the harms that they've created, but we mustn't invisibilize how much the global north has contributed to this problem and how much cities, as the largest emitters, have contributed to this problem. And I worry that by invisibilizing that, by not talking about that responsibility, we forget the debt that the global north owes. And that's not just a theoretical worry. Trump has pulled out of the Green Climate Fund $2 billion, and the whole We Are Still A movement has not really talked about this. Seattle put out a call to cities across the country to join them in contributing in some way, even a small amount, and no cities are stepping up to this. So I'd like to see this discourse recognize this, and I'd like to see maybe those cities who are some of the wealthiest cities in the world, some of the richest cities in the world, also think about what they can do to contribute while they also claim liability. So I think those need to go hand in hand. Thank you.
Any thoughts, responses on that?
I mean, I'll say I think it's a fair point. I would say that San Francisco in particular has mobilized an enormous amount of efforts from departments ranging from the Department of Public Works to our Department of Environment to address the issue. We're not laying all climate change at the foot of these fossil fuel companies, but in the same way that we are expending resources now to deal with the problem now, they are also they were a meaningful causer, and it's not really a word. They were a meaningful contributor, and so they should be meaningful, someone who is contributing to the meaningful remedy. But it's a good point.
Yeah, I think it's a good point too, and I think it's a good caution to not make it sound like the blame is being shifted, but here is another opportunity to demonstrate what has to be done.
Yeah, thanks very much for a really informative panel. I think and maybe based on the question, a lot of other people find that the narrative around the kind of bad action of the fossil fuel industry in terms of kind of denying facts and lobbying against climate change for such a long time, and like that's the real kind of the bad thing that they did, right? And so to what extent can we then tie these attribution statements and more specifically kind of the legal questions to that bad action? And this kind of echoes kind of a previous question too. Is there anyone out there who's exploring, I'm a little bit out of my legal depth here, but like RICO type cases around like what they were doing at the time as a kind of conspiracy and collusion and lying to the public, and holding them responsible specifically for that rather than a kind of nuisance type litigation.
Big oil is the new mafia.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Hold up.
I know that there have been a lot of efforts. I don't know where anything is now, and I don't want to misstate anything, but there's been a lot of attention also paid to consumer communications or advertising laws, and the way in which that the kinds of statements and the kinds of advertorials and the way that the oil companies were getting their message of obfuscation and misinformation out might be in violation of those standards. I'll also say, though, that another interesting element of this litigation is the financial litigation part of it, that these companies interact with the public, but they also interact with their shareholders. And there are a ton of corporate and securities laws that require honesty and disclosure and forewarning of material risks. And there are currently cases going now against Exxon and maybe definitely at least against Exxon, of shareholders suing Exxon for misrepresenting the value of its reserves, basically saying that they would be able to dig up and sell and overvalue these reserves. Also, the investigation from the New York State Attorney General's office is in part a Martin Act investigation, which is about financial fraud. So, short answer, yes. Yeah, there's quite a bit moving. Yeah.
My name is Glenn. I actually brought up with my city the possibility of engaging in one of these lawsuits, and the answer that I got kind of indirectly through channels was that they were scared. They were scared of financial risk they might be running, and it's a small city. So I wonder if you could maybe comment on that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that. And Yvonne, maybe talk about what ExxonMobil among the defendants has done to sort of intimidate plaintiffs.
I mean, it's real. I understand the fear. It is not easy to bring a lawsuit against some of the largest companies in the world, and one of the consequences of us bringing our action against Exxon was that Exxon sued my boss, Dennis Herrera, in court in Texas, trying to hold him as a city attorney in San Francisco answerable to courts in Texas. I think that was a tactic that was designed to intimidate and punish a city from exercising its rights. Again, I said Dennis was bold, and he is, and so he was not intimidated, but we've seen this in other contexts. Cities are worried about not only the expense, but retaliation by other governments. We've seen in the sanctuary city context, cities like Miami who shy away from policies that were well-reasoned and deliberate because of threats by the federal government. This is an action that the fossil fuel companies are not embracing. And so I understand that the fear is real. I just think that sometimes one has to have a commitment to the larger issue and some courage to take these issues on. And one way that a smaller city can do that is to work with and collaborate with a coalition of cities, either a coalition of cities or come together with a larger city to bring a case together. That it might make a smaller city more comfortable in bringing that action, and it would also, it would raise the stakes and the profile of that particular case. It's something for them to think about.
And could you just, Yvonne, talk about what happened yesterday? You were kind of talking about state attorneys general investigation. So there's the New York one, but also one in Massachusetts. And yesterday, I believe ExxonMobil appealed that to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, they are litigating these cases aggressively. I think that they believe that if, because there are many jurisdictions that are fighting this fight and many more jurisdictions that are affected, to lose would set in motion a chain of litigation that might not inure to their benefit. And so they have been traditionally very aggressive.
Great. My question was actually exactly on that. Can you hear me? Dominic Frangillo, former council member, Caroline, New York. And my question is, it was exactly on organizing elected officials, thank you for the shout out, on around climate mitigation across municipal boundaries. So just for some context, right, there's two courts, right? There's the legal court, and then there's the court of public opinion. And our experience, we're actually working with many of the cities that have elected officials that have sued, that have active lawsuits or have filed. Imperial Beach, the mayor, we have 9 supervisors that have signed on a letter to the Governor Brown to phase out fossil fuel production in the state. Benicia, Culver City, others. And how do we link together elected officials that may not have the resources, may not have the technical knowledge, may not have the political capital locally to spearhead something, but would be totally willing to go on, to go together with others. And public opinion, just for context or experience in New York, for example, we organized nearly 1,000 elected officials across the state to ban fracking and push forward on divestment stuff, and that helped provide the political space for New York City to, I was just talking with Dan, we're working closely with the mayor's office to make their announcements on divestment and to come out with lawsuits. So how can, I guess my question is, are there organized efforts already of elected officials beyond, or cities beyond municipal boundaries and in regions across states that are thinking about climate litigation? Is there a role for peer-to-peer organizing to help share information and so that they can all kind of, multiple ones can jump in together? Have you heard about that, or what?
I mean, there are, in California, for example, there are organizations of local governments, the California League of Cities, the International Municipal Lawyers Association, that sometimes convene specific issues, whether it's on opioids or climate change, where they share information. I think, in my experience, elected officials are very willing to collaborate and get together, and in part it's just creating those networks and having those communications. I think there are also other ways that cities can get involved in an issue like this shy of filing, and that is filing amicus briefs, right? Being amici gets the viewpoint of how harmful something is without having to devote the resources to litigation. So those are some ideas.
Anything from Stephen or May on that?
I would just add a parallel from the fossil fuel divestment movement, which is that this does require some degree of technical knowledge, which can be a bit intimidating to get involved, but it's a very overcomable problem. And part of what I think helped divestment pick up speed so quickly is that there were some centralized tools for people about things you need to know when you meet a board of trustees and what questions you're likely to get asked. So resources like that could probably be prepared on this issue. Of course, there's specific differences in each city, but there are some generalizable resources, and maybe that's a follow-up from this event, is thinking about who could build that tool set.
Before we go to the next question, I just want to remind folks that there is plenty of other information in the lobby. Union of Concerned Scientists, perhaps 350. I've got information out there. Got copies of Sierra Magazine, et cetera. So make sure you grab those, because those are also some good resources just to start with. Just want to make sure we hit that before we do this next question.
Hi, I'm a recent law school graduate, and I was curious about sort of how this case might proceed going forward. I know there's some limits on what can be answered because it's pending, but I was wondering whether the increased access to and adoption of clean energy is relevant, whether you think it's relevant in that benefit burden analysis of the public nuisance claim, because it seems to me that there's an argument that was raised that there wasn't really a choice for a lot of people, but that increasingly people are making a choice that doesn't carry that burden and that reaps just the same benefits. I was wondering whether that's an argument that might be deployed.
I think that's an argument that it's a theme that might come up if one of these cases goes to trial on its merit. I think right now, one thing that the Ninth Circuit is going to have to settle is whether or not these cases belong in federal court or state court. Our Northern District judges, Allsup and Chabria, respectively, came to 2 different conclusions, which is why the San Mateo case proceeds in state court, and our case is at the Ninth Circuit from appeal from a federal district court judge. So I think one thing that needs to be decided next steps is whether or not this is global warming cases that cause public nuisance properly live as a federal common law claim or whether they live as a state law public nuisance claim. I think the other thing, and I think that emanating from that will be other issues that will frame the cases. But I think, whether or not the embracing by society of cleaner or alternate sources of energy. How that cuts, I'm frankly not quite sure. Because on the one hand, you could argue, right, that the additional information has caused people to make a different choice, a choice that they wouldn't have made when we were operating under a scheme of misinformation. On the other hand, despite those renewable energy sources, there is still a demand for the production, and we still as a society rely on fossil fuel products. And so whether or not a court, if balancing the utility of the conduct against the harm that is caused, would still, despite those embracing renewable energy, would come to a different conclusion, I just don't know. It's an excellent question.
Thank you.
Another question there?
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. I was speaking with my neighbor about comparing the climate change litigation with previous litigation campaigns. One of the things that occurred to us is the urgency for speed, the need for speed. And in that connection, I was thinking about Judge Allsup's opinion and how he didn't seem to dwell on the reality of climate change. Neither was it really fought over by the oil companies, and I'm wondering if that's how much more work needs to be done to convince judges that climate change is a reality. It's not something we have to fight over in court. It can't be used to hold up litigation, and then how much more work needs to be done to take that conclusion in the courts and bring it to society and say this is now a done deal. This is now recognized by the courts, and what the value of that would be.
Yeah, I'm trying to structure this in my head. I think that I don't know how much of a difference, and maybe you all disagree, getting judges to that stage have from just getting the public at large to that level. I think continuing to just raise the urgency of what is actually happening. I know the IPCC 1.5 report's coming out soon, and it is what we expected, which is we have not very much time before things get really catastrophic. And so I think potentially just raising the level of urgency at large amongst the public will inform the judiciary as just members of the public. Although I do take your second point that the kind of threshold or watershed moment where it becomes clear that climate change is justiciable and is appropriate in a particular venue and under a particular cause of action is extremely important in really crystallizing and getting people to understand, here is a tangible thing that can be done that is perhaps less speculative than they think, and that can lead to real measurable change in terms of dollars and seawalls and sewer systems that get upgraded.
And the only other thing I would add is I'm not, the law has certain ways to deal with matters of urgency. These cases concede that climate change is an inevitability. So I'm not sure that the court sees a sense of urgency in the way that it would see it in other contexts. That said, we're looking at, I think you'll have a ruling from the Ninth Circuit within a year or two, which is, in terms of legal battles, not that long. But again, litigation is just one tool. It's a great tool. I do it as my full-time job, so clearly I embrace it. But it is never going to be the only tool that's going to resolve this issue. All of the organizing and public education and community building that we're talking about here needs to happen while the courts are getting their arms around this issue.
Christine, I think you wanted to add something about the matter of speed.
Yeah, well, it wasn't particularly about the matter of speed, but it was just about the need to have a public consensus that climate change is real and happening. We live in a country where, I don't have the exact number, but something like 30% of our public does not believe in evolution, right? And yet, that hasn't changed the fact that evolution is happening. It hasn't changed the fact in most parts of the country that we don't teach evolution, that we don't teach creationism in schools, right? So, this doesn't get to the question of how the judges in the public relate necessarily, but we know that there can be incredible action without having a public consensus, right? So, at some point, we do want people to be able to elect officials who are pro-climate action. And yet, we have a very diverse country. We have huge spectrum of beliefs. And so the notion that everyone will be on board with this, I think, is something that I, as climate scientists, have to step back and say, you know what, that may not happen, and yet we can move forward.
And I think on that point of moving forward, we're going to move forward throughout the rest of the program. I know we got 2 more questioners, but we're out of time. You guys will be able to buttonhole these folks later and ask your question. I know we've got some final words from Janet Cox from Fossil Free California, who I think was going to wrap up here. And then again, I'm sure that May and Stephen and Yvonne and Christina will stick around for any other questions you all have. Thank you so much for being a fantastic audience. And let's give a round of applause before we hear the last words from Janet.
First, I have to announce a crisis. Bill McKibben left his hat. So if somebody finds it, we're going to give it to May or to Jane. Do you have it?
No, I don't have it, but I can deliver.
We need to find his hat. Short of that, I want to thank you all so much for coming. This day turned out to be better than we ever expected, and we thought it was going to be great. But from this morning to now, we've come at this question of addressing climate change through various financial, legal mechanisms that everybody can have a part in a way that what I think is we're all going to leave here and in 3 hours or tomorrow, it's all going to sort of come together in our heads, and we're going to realize that there's something that every single one of us can do that will actually make a difference. Wherever you are, whatever you think about, whatever you're working on, we can do this. And this tremendous smorgasbord of ideas and the parade of fascinating people to listen to has really just been a gift. So I want to say just a couple words about Fossil Free California. We're smaller than we look, but we need to be bigger, and we need everybody's volunteer ideas. We need people who are willing to step up and run something. We also could use your money, but it's really a wonderful group of folks who are sort of addicted to the idea that we're just going to keep going because we're onto something. And what we're onto is the relationship between money and pollution and climate change. And I was in Paris in 2015, and the sort of the thing that came to me at the end of that was, this is the world against the oil companies. It was really clear. And that's where we still are, but 3 years later, the oil companies are aware of this in a way that they weren't then. They can hear us coming, and we've just got to keep at it, and we can do it. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to this wonderful panel. Go forth and join us.